The Galactic Academy, floating in deep space, looked like a giant crystal flower made of pure light. Ships from hundreds of different worlds docked at its many ports every day. Students from across the galaxy came here to learn about the universe and each other. Minho walked through the main hallway, his footsteps echoing on the smooth floor. Other students moved around him in ways that still surprised him after 6 months. Some floated without touching the ground. Others seemed to be made of bright energy that shifted colors as they moved. A few looked like giant insects walking. On 4 legs, their voices making clicking sounds as they talked. He was human. One of only 3 humans in the entire academy. The classroom door slid open as he approached. Professor Velthari stood at the front, his body made of what looked like living crystal that sparkled in the light. His voice came from somewhere inside that crystal form, smooth and cold. "Welcome to Advanced Studies in Primitive Species," the professor said as students took their seats. "Today we will examine one of the most backward races in the galaxy." Minho found his usual spot in the back row. Next to him sat Crix, a student from the Saurian Empire. Crix looked like a large lizard that walked upright, with scales that changed color based on his mood. Right now they were a dull green, which meant he was bored. "The humans of Earth," Professor Velthari continued, and Minho felt his stomach tighten. "A species so primitive they have barely left their home star system." A holographic image appeared in the center of the room. It showed a human spacecraft, the kind Minho had traveled in to reach the academy. It looked rough and metal compared to the sleek ships the other species used. The class began to laugh, not the kind of laughter humans made, but the sounds each species made when they found something funny. The luminals made musical tones. The insect-like hive creatures buzzed loudly. The saurians made hissing sounds. "Look at this design," the professor said, pointing to the human ship. "They strap themselves to controlled explosions and hope they don't die. Their bodies are so weak they need special suits just to survive. In space, they cannot even breathe in most environments." More laughter filled the room. Minho saw Suin across the classroom. She was another human student, and her face was red with anger. The third human, Wubin, sat in the middle rows, writing notes. His expression showed nothing, but Minho knew he was listening to every word. "Professor," said a student from the energy-based luminals, her voice like singing, "why do we study such a backward species? They will never advance beyond their single world." "An excellent question," Professor Velthari replied. "We study primitive species to understand how evolution can go wrong. Look at their technology." New images appeared. Minho recognized them as human space stations and moon bases. To him, they looked amazing, but he could see how they might seem simple to beings who could travel faster than light or change matter with their thoughts. "They use chemical reactions for power," the professor continued. "They build with metal and concrete like cave dwellers. Their computers are so primitive they still use physical switches and buttons. Most amusing of all, they think they are explorers." The laughter grew louder. Crix next to Minho was now bright orange, which meant he found something very funny. He looked at Minho and shook his head. "Your people are like children playing with toys," Crix said, not trying to be mean but not understanding how his words hurt. "It is cute but not serious." Minho raised his hand. The laughter slowly stopped as Professor Velthari noticed. "Yes, young primitive," the professor said. A few students giggled at the insult. "You say humans are primitive," Minho said, keeping his voice steady. "But we've survived in space for over 200 years. We've built colonies on other worlds. We explore places other species won't go." "Ah, yes," Professor Velthari said, his crystal form shimmering with what looked like amusement. "Human exploration. Tell me, how far from Earth have your people actually traveled?" Minho knew the answer would sound pathetic to these beings who crossed the galaxy in days. "About 50 light years." The class erupted in laughter again. 50 light years was nothing to species that had spread across thousands of light years. 50 light years in 2 centuries, the professor repeated. "My people crossed our entire galaxy in less time than that. The hive minds can send their consciousness across the universe instantly. Even the saurians who prefer physical travel have explored further than humans ever will." A hive creature raised one of its 4 arms. "Professor, do humans even understand faster-than-light travel?" "They have theories," Professor Velthari said with obvious mockery. But they cannot build ships that use anything beyond basic physics. They are trapped by their primitive understanding of the universe. Minho felt his face getting hot. Everything the professor said was technically true, but it missed something important. He couldn't explain what that something was, but he felt it deep in his chest. Their bodies are also laughably weak, the professor continued. They die if the temperature gets too hot or cold. They cannot survive in most atmospheric conditions. They need artificial gravity, or their bones become weak. They are prisoners of their own biology. Unlike us, said a luminal student proudly. We can exist in any environment. Our consciousness can survive even if our energy patterns are disrupted. Exactly, Professor Velthari agreed. Evolution favors species that transcend physical limitations. Humans remain trapped by matter, energy, time, and space. They cannot manipulate reality through thought like the psionics. They cannot phase through solid objects like the dimensionals. They cannot even communicate telepathically like most civilized species. Suin raised her hand. Professor Velthari looked at her with the same condescending expression. Yes, primitive. Student? What about human creativity and problem-solving? Suin asked. Humans adapt to new situations quickly. Creativity is what primitive minds call random trial and error, the professor replied smoothly. Advanced species use logic and proven methods. We don't need to adapt because we can shape our environment to match our needs. But what if your advanced technology fails? Wubin asked from his seat. It was the first time he had spoken in class. The question seemed to surprise Professor Velthari. Fail? Our technology has been perfected over millions of years. Why would it fail? Everything fails sometimes, Wubin said quietly. What do you do then? We fix it with our superior technology, Crix answered, as if the question was stupid. Or we use our natural abilities. Saurians are born with stronger bodies than humans. We don't break as easily. The luminals simply transfer to a new energy matrix, added a glowing student. Physical damage cannot truly harm us. The hive shares consciousness across many bodies, buzzed an insect student. If some fail, others continue. Wubin nodded slowly, still writing in his notebook. I see. Professor Velthari looked pleased with these answers. This is why humans will never advance beyond their current primitive state. They are trapped by the weaknesses of individual biological forms. They cannot transcend the basic limitations of physical existence. The class began to end. Students started gathering their belongings and floating, walking, or phasing toward the door. Minho packed his simple paper notebook and pen. Around him, other students stored information directly, in their minds or in crystals that held thousands of books worth of data. Remember, Professor Velthari called out as they left. Next week we will study the Zephyrians, another primitive species that destroyed itself through warfare. Perhaps you will see the pattern of how lesser species inevitably fail. As Minho walked toward the door, he heard Crix talking to another Saurian student. I almost feel sorry for the humans, Crix was saying. They try so hard, but they will never understand the universe like we do. It is sad to watch them struggle with such simple things. Minho stepped into the hallway where Suin was waiting. For him. Her face was still red with anger. Did you hear that? She said. They think we're animals playing with sticks and stones. I heard, Minho replied. He looked around to make sure no other students were listening, then lowered his voice. We need to talk to Wubin, all three of us together. Why? Suin asked. Minho thought about the professor's words, about the laughter, about the way every species seemed so certain that humans were doomed to remain primitive forever. Because, he said slowly, I think they're missing something important about us. Something big. 3 days after the embarrassing class about primitive species, Professor Velthari made an announcement that changed everything. This semester, you will work in mixed teams to solve real galactic problems, he said, his crystal body flickering with what looked like excitement. Each team will include students from different species. You will use your people's natural abilities and technology to find solutions. Minho felt his stomach drop. Mixed teams meant he would have to work with students who thought humans were barely smarter than animals. The problems you face will test everything you've learned, the professor continued. Some teams will succeed using advanced methods. Others will fail because they cannot think beyond primitive limitations. Professor Velthari's meaning was clear. The human students were expected to fail. The professor began reading team assignments. Minho found himself paired with Crix, the Saurian, and Zara, a luminal energy being. Across the room, Suen was placed with 2 hive creatures and a psionic who could move objects with his mind. Wubin ended up with a dimensional who could phase through walls and a quantum manipulator. Your first scenario, Professor Velthari announced, and the room filled with a holographic display, is establishing a mining colony on Zarion Prime, a world with extreme temperature swings and toxic atmosphere. The display showed a planet that changed from burning hot to freezing cold every 12 hours. The atmosphere would kill most life forms instantly. You have 1 week to design your solution, the professor said. Present your plans next Tuesday. The teams spread out across the classroom to begin planning. Minho approached his teammates carefully. So, Crix said, his scales turning a thoughtful blue color. This is simple. We use standard Saurian environmental suits and thermal shields. Zara's energy form pulsed brighter. Why use physical protection? I can exist in any environment. We simply transfer consciousness to energy patterns that adapt automatically. They both looked at Minho as if waiting for him to agree or ask questions. Instead, he pulled out his notebook and started sketching. What are you doing? Crix asked. Thinking about the temperature changes, Minho said. Every 12 hours from hot to cold. That creates expansion and contraction. Any rigid structure will crack apart. Not with Saurian building materials, Crix said proudly. Our crystalline metals can withstand any temperature. But what if they can't? Minho asked. What if something goes wrong with the materials, or the supply shipments are delayed? Crix looked confused. Why would anything go wrong? Our technology has worked for thousands of years. Minho showed them his sketch. It was a simple design using flexible joints and materials that could expand and contract safely. The buildings could actually move with the temperature changes instead of fighting them. This is very primitive, Zara said, her musical voice sounding disappointed. Humans still think in terms of mechanical solutions. But it would work even if your energy transfer systems failed, Minho pointed out. Our systems don't fail, Zara replied as if the idea was impossible. The week passed quickly. Other teams worked with confidence, using the advanced abilities of their species. Minho watched Suen struggling with her team, who kept dismissing her suggestions about backup plans and simple solutions. When presentation day came, most teams had elegant solutions. The psionics created mental barriers that could adjust to any environment. The dimensionals simply existed partly outside normal space where temperature didn't affect them. The quantum manipulators changed the basic properties of matter to make construction materials that were perfect for any condition. Minho's team presented Crix's plan for super-strong crystalline buildings protected by energy shields. Excellent work, Professor Velthari said. The Saurian approach shows proper advanced thinking. He barely glanced at Minho's backup designs. Then came the second scenario the following week. A space station near a pulsar star was losing power and life support. The radiation made it impossible for most species to get close. Again, simple, Crix said confidently. Our ships have radiation shielding. I can't exist as pure energy, Zara added. Radiation cannot harm my consciousness. But Minho was thinking about something else. What if the radiation is stronger than expected? What if it damages your shields or disrupts energy patterns? You worry too much about failure, Crix said, his scales turning orange with amusement. Advanced species prepare for success, not failure. Minho designed a solution using lead shielding, redundant mechanical systems, and robots that could work in high radiation. His teammates ignored it completely. During the presentation, Crix explained how Saurian technology would easily handle the radiation. Zara described how energy beings were naturally immune to such problems. Brilliant, Professor Velthari said. This demonstrates the superiority of transcending physical limitations. The scenarios kept coming, week after week. Each time, the alien students used their advanced abilities with complete confidence. Each time, Minho suggested simpler backup plans that his teammates dismissed. The fourth scenario involved first contact with a hostile alien species. Suen's team ignored her ideas about careful communication and patience. The psionics wanted to simply read the aliens' minds and force peaceful thoughts. The hive creatures planned to share consciousness and make the hostile aliens think like them. What if they resist your mental abilities? Suin asked during her team's planning session. Nothing can resist a properly focused psionic assault, her teammate replied. But what if something can? Suin pressed. Her teammates looked at her with pity. Primitive minds always fear what they cannot understand, one of the hive creatures buzzed. The fifth scenario was rescuing colonists from a planet where volcanic activity was destroying all technology. Wubin's team planned to use quantum tunneling to extract people instantly. What if the volcanic activity interferes with quantum fields? Wubin asked quietly. Impossible, his dimensional teammate said. Quantum effects work at the fundamental level of reality. But what if this situation is different? Wubin continued. You think too much like a primitive, the quantum manipulator said dismissively. Advanced science has already solved these problems. Week after week, the same pattern repeated. The alien students were brilliant and confident. Their solutions were elegant and used incredible technology. But every time a human student asked, what if it doesn't work, they were told that advanced technology didn't fail. Minho, Suin, and Wubin started meeting secretly in the Academy's library after classes. They sat in a quiet corner where few other students came. They all think the same way, Suin said during one of their meetings. Every species uses their special abilities and assumes nothing will go wrong. It's like they've never had technology fail, Wubin added, or encountered a problem their standard methods couldn't solve. Minho was drawing diagrams in his notebook. Back on Earth, we have a saying, anything that can go wrong will go wrong. Engineers plan for failure. But these species have had technology for millions of years, Suin pointed out. Maybe their stuff really doesn't fail. Or maybe, Wubin said slowly, they've never been in situations where failure happens. They looked at each other. A strange idea beginning to form. Humans have different experiences, Minho said. We're used to things breaking. We fix them and keep going. We plan for problems because we've had lots of problems, Suin agreed. What if, Wubin said very quietly, that's not primitive thinking? What if that's actually an advantage? The idea seemed crazy. How could being used to failure be better than having perfect technology? But as they talked, examples started adding up. Human space missions always had backup plans for backup plans. Human engineers built things that could be repaired with simple tools. Human explorers carried redundant equipment because they knew things would break. The Academy teaches that advancement means transcending limitations, Minho said. But what if learning to work within limitations is also valuable? What if being primitive taught us something these advanced species never learned? Suin added. They were still discussing this when Professor Velthari's announcement came the next week. For your final project, he said, his crystal form practically glowing with anticipation, you will face an impossible scenario. Your deep space research vessel has suffered complete system failure. All advanced technology is offline. You have only basic physics and chemistry to work with. You must survive and return home across hundreds of light years. The professor looked directly at the three human students. This should demonstrate once and for all why primitive thinking leads to extinction while advanced species thrive. The class fell completely silent. Several alien students looked confused or scared. The luminals seemed especially upset, since they needed advanced containment fields to exist. How can we solve this? One Saurian student asked. Without technology, we're helpless. Exactly, Professor Velthari said with satisfaction. This scenario separates advanced thinkers from primitive ones. Minho, Suin, and Wubin looked at each other across the classroom. For the first time since arriving at the Academy, they weren't worried. They were excited, because for the first time, they were facing a problem that sounded exactly like the kind of problems humans had been solving for centuries. The final scenario details appeared on every student's desk the next morning. Minho read through the specifications while eating breakfast in the Academy cafeteria. Around him, alien students were having very different reactions to the same information. At the Saurian table, scales were shifting rapidly through colors that meant confusion and fear. The luminals gathered in a corner, their energy forms flickering weakly as they tried to understand how they could exist without containment technology. Even the confident psionics looked worried as they realized telepathy wouldn't help with mechanical problems. The scenario was detailed and harsh. The research vessel, Deep Explorer, had been investigating an unknown energy anomaly at the edge of the galaxy when everything went wrong. Cascading system failures had destroyed all faster-than-light drives, communication arrays, telepathic amplifiers, quantum manipulation devices, and dimensional phase generators. Complete technology failure, Minho read aloud to himself. All advanced systems offline. Crew must rely on basic physical principles only. The specifications continued. The ship was stranded 847 light-years from the nearest inhabited system. It had basic life support, food for 6 months, and whatever materials could be found in the ship's storage areas. The crew included representatives from multiple species, each with their own environmental needs. Survive and return home using only primitive methods, the document concluded. At the table behind Minho, 2 quantum manipulators were having an argument. "This is impossible," one was saying. "Without quantum field generators, we cannot alter the basic properties of space-time. Maybe we could send a message somehow?" the other suggested weakly. "How?" "We need quantum entanglement arrays to communicate across galactic distances. Basic radio waves would take 847 years to reach anyone." Minho finished reading and looked around the cafeteria. For the first time since arriving at the academy, he saw fear on alien faces. Real fear. Suen sat down across from him with her food tray. "Have you seen how everyone's reacting?" she asked quietly. "They're scared," Minho replied. "They've never had to solve problems without their technology." "Crix asked me this morning if humans had any primitive survival instincts his team could use," Suen said. "He looked embarrassed to even ask." Wubin joined them, carrying his notebook. "3 different students have approached me asking about basic chemistry and mechanical engineering. They don't understand what those things even mean." "Because they've never needed to," Minho said. "When you can manipulate matter with your thoughts, why learn chemistry? When you can phase through walls, why understand structural engineering?" They ate in silence for a while, listening to increasingly desperate conversations around them. A group of hive creatures was buzzing frantically about how individual consciousness couldn't survive without the collective network. Some dimensionals were discussing whether they could exist in normal space for extended periods. "They think this scenario is designed to be impossible," Suen observed. "Maybe for them it is," Wubin said thoughtfully, "but not for us." After breakfast, they met in their secret corner of the library. Wubin had already started sketching ideas in his notebook. "The key problem is distance," he said, showing his diagrams. 847 light-years is impossible to cross at normal speeds within a human lifetime. "Unless you don't try to do it in one lifetime," Minho said slowly. Suen looked up from her own notes. "What do you mean?" "Generation ships," Minho explained. "We build a ship that can sustain life for centuries. Multiple generations live and die during the journey." "Can that work?" Suen asked. "Humans have been planning generation ships since the 20th century, Wubin replied. "The math is complicated but possible. You need closed-loop life support, sustainable food production, and social structures that maintain purpose across generations." They spent the next hour working through basic calculations. How much food could be grown in hydroponic gardens? How could they recycle air and water indefinitely? What materials were available on the stranded ship? "The energy source is the biggest problem," Minho said. "We need power for life support, but we can't use any of their advanced systems." "Radioactive decay," Wubin suggested. "Basic radioisotope thermal generators. They work on simple physics and can run for decades." "Can we build those?" Suen asked. "If the ship has any radioactive materials and basic metalworking tools?" "Yes," Wubin replied. "Humans have been using RTGs since the 1960s. As they worked, other students passed by their table looking increasingly desperate. A psionics student was asking the librarian if there were any books about primitive problem-solving. A group of saurians was trying to understand what mechanical advantage meant. "They're lost," Suen said quietly. "They're brilliant at using their abilities, but they don't understand the fundamentals underneath. It's like they skipped basic physics and went straight to magic," Minho agreed. "That's exactly what they did," Wubin said. "Look at their histories. Every species developed advanced abilities early in their evolution. They never had to understand how things actually work at the basic level. But humans had to understand everything from the ground up, Suin added. We couldn't manipulate matter with thought, so we learned chemistry. We couldn't phase through walls, so we learned structural engineering. We couldn't travel faster than light, so we learned orbital mechanics. We learned to work within physical laws instead of transcending them, Minho concluded. They worked through the afternoon, developing their solution. The plan was complex, but based on proven human technology. Solar collectors to supplement the radioactive power source, hydroponic systems for food production, water recycling through distillation and chemical purification, atmospheric processing, using catalytic converters in plants. The social aspect is important too, Suin pointed out. How do you keep people motivated during a journey that will take centuries? Humans have thought about this, Minho replied. You create a ship-based culture. People know they're part of something bigger than themselves. They're not just surviving, they're preserving their civilization and making sure their descendants reach home. Like planting trees you'll never see grow, Wubin added. Exactly. As the week progressed, they refined their plan. They researched what materials would likely be available on a deep space research vessel. They calculated power requirements, food production rates, and population dynamics. They designed mechanical systems that could be maintained and repaired by people who understood basic principles. Meanwhile, the rest of the class struggled. Professor Velthari held special office hours to help students understand primitive concepts. Minho walked past one session and heard the professor trying to explain what gravity was to students who had never needed to think about it. Gravity is a fundamental force that affects all matter, the professor was saying. It cannot be turned off or ignored. But why would you want to work with it instead of just canceling it out? A dimensional student asked, genuinely confused. Because in this scenario you cannot cancel it out, the professor replied, sounding frustrated. You must work within its limitations. That's so primitive, the student said sadly. 3 days before the presentation deadline, Crix approached Minho after class. The Saurian's scales were a worried gray color. Minho, he said carefully, my team is having difficulties with the scenario. We were wondering if you had any insights. What kind of difficulties? Minho asked. We cannot understand how to sustain life without environmental control systems, Crix admitted. Our crystalline technology requires specific energy inputs that will not be available. Have you tried thinking about basic biological needs? Minho suggested. Air, water, food, shelter, temperature control using simple methods? Crix looked confused. How can temperature control be simple? Insulation, Minho said. Trapping air between layers, using body heat, basic thermodynamics. I do not understand. These concepts, Crix said, looking embarrassed. Saurians have always used environmental suits that automatically adjust to any conditions. What happens if the suits break? Crix stared at him. They do not break. Why would they break? Minho realized that Crix literally could not imagine his technology failing. It was like asking a human to imagine what they would do if gravity stopped. Working. I could show you some basic principles, Minho offered. Simple engineering that doesn't require advanced technology. You would help us? Crix asked, surprised. Even though we called your people primitive? Minho thought about it. Knowledge should be shared, he said finally. Besides, in this scenario, we're all on the same ship. We have to work together. Thank you, Crix said, his scales turning a grateful blue. I am beginning to think that perhaps primitive methods have value after all. Similar conversations were happening throughout the academy. Students who had mocked human limitations were quietly asking for help understanding basic science. The three humans found themselves in the strange position of teaching fundamental concepts to species that could manipulate reality with their minds. It's ironic, Suin said during one of their library meetings. They're so advanced, they've become helpless. Not helpless, Wubin corrected. Specialized. They're incredibly good at what they do, but they've never had to be generalists. Humans had to be generalists to survive, Minho added. We couldn't rely on special abilities, so we had. Presentation day arrived with an atmosphere of tension that Minho had never felt at the academy before. Students who normally floated confidently through the halls now moved with nervous energy. The usual sounds of telepathic communication and energy harmonics were replaced by actual spoken conversations as advanced species tried to work through problems they had never encountered. Professor Velthari entered the classroom with what looked like anticipation glowing in his crystalline form. Today, we discover which minds can truly adapt to challenging circumstances, he announced, and which cannot transcend their limitations. The first team to present was led by Zara, the luminal energy being. Her form flickered weakly as she began to speak. Our solution focuses on consciousness transfer, she said, her musical voice less confident than usual. We would abandon physical forms and exist as pure energy during the journey. Interesting, Professor Velthari said. How would you maintain energy cohesion without containment fields? Zara's glow dimmed further. We would use natural electromagnetic fields from the ship's metal structure. And if those fields are insufficient, then we would. Zara paused, her form flickering rapidly. We would adapt somehow. How specifically? We do not know, Zara admitted quietly. Without our technology, we cannot calculate field requirements or predict energy decay rates. Murmurs of sympathy came from other energy-based students. It was becoming clear that this team had no real solution. The next presentation came from a group of psionics. Their leader, a tall being with large eyes and pale skin, approached the front nervously. We propose using mental projection to contact distant civilizations, he said. Our thoughts can travel faster than light across space. Excellent theory, Professor Velthari replied. How far can unassisted psionic projection reach? Under normal circumstances, with amplification devices, we can reach anywhere in the galaxy, the psionic answered proudly. And without amplification devices? The student's confidence crumbled. Perhaps. A few star systems, maybe less. We have never tested the natural limits. So you would die before reaching help? Yes. Probably. Team after team presented similar failures. The dimensionals could not phase through space without their generators. The quantum manipulators could not alter physics without their reality modification equipment. Even the physically strong Saurians struggled without their environmental suits and crystalline technology. Each presentation followed the same pattern. Elegant theories that collapsed when examined. Advanced beings reduced to helplessness without their specialized tools. Minho watched his classmates with growing understanding. These species were not stupid or weak. They were incredibly advanced. But they had become so specialized that they could not function outside their areas of expertise. It is like watching birds trying to swim, Wubin whispered during one particularly painful presentation. They are masters of flight, but helpless in water. Finally, Professor Velthari called the 3 human students to present. Minho, Suin, and Wubin walked to the front of the classroom together. The alien students watched them with expressions ranging from pity to curiosity. Let us see what primitive minds can accomplish, Professor Velthari said, his tone suggesting he expected entertainment rather than solutions. Minho began their presentation calmly. Our solution assumes that all advanced technology has failed completely. We focus on basic physical principles that work in any environment. He activated the classroom's display system and showed their first diagram. It was a simple cross-section of a generation ship designed for centuries of travel. This is our approach to the distance problem, Minho continued. Since we cannot travel faster than light, we create a ship that can sustain life for the entire journey. Multiple human generations will be born, live, and die during the trip home. Confused murmurs filled the classroom. Several students exchanged glances. You plan to die during the journey? Crix asked, his scales turning a puzzled yellow. Yes, Suin replied, taking over the presentation. We plan the mission knowing that the people who start it will not be the ones who finish it, but that is acceptable, because the mission will be completed. But why would you start something you cannot finish? A hive creature buzzed in confusion. Because humans have always built things for the future, Wubin explained. We plant trees knowing we will never sit in their shade. We build cathedrals that take centuries to complete. We preserve knowledge for people who are not yet born. The alien students looked baffled by this concept. Species that could live for thousands of years or transfer their consciousness to new bodies had never needed to think beyond their individual existence. "Let us examine the technical details," Professor Velthari said, clearly skeptical. "How do you propose to maintain life support for centuries without advanced technology?" Suin stepped forward with their detailed plans. "We use closed-loop systems based on natural cycles. Plants consume carbon dioxide and produce oxygen. Water is recycled through distillation and filtration. Waste becomes fertilizer for food production." She showed diagrams of hydroponic gardens, water recycling systems, and atmospheric processors. Everything was based on chemistry and biology rather than advanced technology. "These systems can be maintained and repaired by people who understand basic principles," Suin continued. "If something breaks, you fix it with available materials and simple tools." "What if your plants die?" asked a quantum manipulator. "We plan for that," Wubin replied. "We carry multiple types of seeds. We have backup growing systems. We preserve genetic diversity. When one approach fails, we try another." "You plan for failure?" a psionic student asked, shocked. "We assume failure," Minho corrected. "Humans learned long ago that everything breaks eventually. So we designed systems that can break safely and be repaired by ordinary people." Professor Velthari's crystalline form was flickering rapidly now. "Your power requirements alone would be enormous. How do you propose to generate energy for centuries?" "Radioactive decay," Wubin answered confidently. "Radioisotope thermal. Generators use the natural breakdown of radioactive materials to produce heat and electricity. They work on basic physics and can operate for decades without maintenance. We supplement with solar collectors when near stars," Suin added, "and use the ship's motion to generate power through magnetic induction." "These are incredibly primitive methods," Professor Velthari said. "Yes," Minho agreed. "That is exactly why they work. Primitive methods use basic laws of physics that cannot be turned off or disrupted. They work anywhere in the universe under any conditions." The classroom was completely silent now. Students, who had been fidgeting or whispering, were focused entirely on the human presentation. "But the social challenges," a luminal student said weakly. "How do you maintain purpose across generations? How do you prevent society from collapsing during such a long journey?" "Humans have experience with long-term projects," Minho replied. "We create ship-based cultures with their own traditions, education systems, and purposes. People know they are part of something larger than themselves." "We tell stories," Suin added. "Stories about where we came from and where we are going. Stories give people meaning even when the journey is longer than their lives. Each generation teaches the next," Wubin continued. "Knowledge is preserved through books, training, and hands-on experience. The ship becomes a traveling civilization. Most importantly," Minho concluded, "we design the journey to be meaningful in itself. People are not just passengers waiting to arrive. They are explorers, researchers, farmers, engineers, teachers, artists. They build full lives during the journey." Professor Velthari was quiet for a long moment. Around the classroom, alien students were staring at the human diagrams with new understanding. "Your solution assumes that advanced beings would be willing to live like primitives for centuries," the professor said finally. "Not like primitives," Suin corrected gently. "Like humans. We never stopped being physical beings who need air, water, food, and purpose. We just got very good at providing those things for ourselves." "Advanced technology is wonderful when it works," Wubin added, "but it makes you helpless when it fails. Basic technology is more reliable because it is simpler." "Humans learned to be generalists because we had to be," Minho concluded. "We cannot manipulate reality with our thoughts, so we learn to work with reality as it is. That turns out to be useful when reality stops cooperating with your thoughts." The presentation ended in silence. Professor Velthari seemed to be processing what he had heard. Finally, he spoke. "This solution is comprehensive," he admitted reluctantly. "You have addressed power, life support, food production, social stability, and long-term maintenance using only basic principles. Because those are the problems humans have always faced," Minho replied. "We have been solving them for thousands of years." "But surely there are flaws," the professor continued. "Weaknesses that make this approach inferior to advanced methods." "Of course there are flaws," Suin agreed. "This approach is slow, requires many people, and depends on maintaining knowledge across generations. It is not elegant or efficient, but it works, Wubin added quietly. Even when everything else fails, basic physics still works, chemistry still works, biology still works, and humans understand all of these things, Professor Velth. The week following the presentations brought changes to the academy that no one had expected. Students who had never spoken to humans before began approaching Minho, Suin, and Wubin with questions. Not mocking questions this time, but genuine curiosity about basic principles they had never needed to understand. "Explain to me again how chemical propulsion works," Crix asked during lunch on Tuesday. His scales were a focused orange color as he tried to understand concepts that seemed impossibly primitive just days before. "You mix fuel and oxidizer," Minho explained patiently. "The chemical reaction creates hot gas that expands rapidly. The gas pushes out of the engine nozzle and the reaction force pushes the spacecraft forward." "But it is so basic," Crix said, not mockingly, but with genuine puzzlement. "Why use chemical reactions when you could manipulate space-time directly?" "Because chemical reactions work everywhere," Suin replied, joining the conversation. "They work near black holes, in energy storms, inside alien technology fields. They use the fundamental forces of nature that cannot be turned off." A psionics student who had been listening nearby leaned closer. "Are you saying that primitive methods are more reliable than advanced ones?" "Not primitive," Wubin corrected, gently. "Fundamental. There is a difference. Fundamental methods use basic laws of physics. Advanced methods often depend on technology that can fail." Word of these conversations was spreading through the academy. Professor Velthari had been unusually quiet since the presentations, spending long hours in his office reviewing recordings of the human solution. Other professors were beginning to ask questions about the curriculum. On Thursday, something unprecedented happened. Professor Velthari announced that he would be presenting a special lecture to the entire academy faculty and student body. The topic: Reconsidering Technological Advancement, Lessons from Primitive Species. The Academy's great auditorium filled with beings from hundreds of worlds. Minho, Suin, and Wubin sat together in the middle section, surrounded by students who watched them with new interest. Professor Velthari appeared on the stage, his crystalline form brighter than usual. "Fellow scholars," he began, "I have spent this week examining the solutions presented in my advanced studies class. What I discovered has challenged my fundamental assumptions about technological progress." A hologram appeared showing the human generation ship design. "This solution, created by our human students, successfully addresses every aspect of the impossible scenario. It provides sustainable life support, reliable power generation, food production, social stability, and mechanical systems that can be maintained across centuries." Murmurs of interest rippled through the audience. Several professors leaned forward to examine the diagrams more closely. "More significantly," Professor Velthari continued, "this solution uses only basic physical principles. No faster-than-light travel, no matter manipulation, no consciousness transfer, no telepathic networks. Just chemistry, biology, and mechanical engineering." The professor's form flickered as he displayed comparison charts. "Every advanced species in my class failed to solve this scenario. Beings capable of manipulating reality itself were helpless when their technology was removed. But humans, who cannot transcend physical limitations, found a way to work within those limitations and succeed." A quantum professor in the front row raised an appendage. "Surely this represents a single unusual scenario. Advanced methods are superior in most circumstances." "That is what I believed," Professor Velthari replied. "So I researched human space exploration to understand how they apply these principles in practice." New holograms appeared showing human spacecraft, space stations, and colonies. To most of the audience, they looked crude and primitive compared to the elegant ships of advanced species. Humans have been exploring space for over 2 centuries. Professor Velthari continued. "Their methods appear primitive, but examine the results." The display changed to show human exploration range. It was not as impressive as the territories claimed by individual advanced species, but it had one surprising characteristic. Human explorers operate independently across vast distances, the professor explained. They do not require supply lines, support networks, or regular contact with their home worlds. Each human ship is self-sufficient and capable of indefinite operation. A Saurian professor stood up. How is this possible? Our most advanced vessels require regular maintenance and support. Because human ships are designed to be repaired by their crews using available materials, Professor Velthari answered. Human space explorers carry machine shops, chemical laboratories, and manufacturing equipment. When something breaks, they fix it or build a replacement. The audience was completely quiet now. This was a concept most advanced species had never considered. Furthermore, the professor continued, humans routinely operate in environments that would disable our technology. They work near pulsars, inside nebulae, and in regions with exotic energy fields. Their primitive methods are immune to interference that would cripple advanced systems. Professor Velthari paused, his form dimming slightly. I have taught for 3 centuries that technological advancement means transcending physical limitations. I believed that species which remained bound by basic physics were evolutionary failures. He looked directly at the 3 human students. I was wrong. The statement sent shockwaves through the auditorium. Several professors began talking at once, their voices creating a chaos of sounds, musical tones, and telepathic static. Order! Professor Velthari called out. Let me finish. The noise gradually died down. Advancement can take 2 paths. He continued. Transcendence and mastery. Most galactic species chose transcendence. We developed abilities that allowed us to ignore basic physical laws. But humans chose mastery. They learned to work with physical laws so effectively that they became more capable than species that can ignore those laws entirely. A new hologram appeared showing a human engineer working on a spacecraft engine. The being looked small and fragile compared to the massive machinery, using simple tools to repair complex systems. When our advanced technology fails, we are helpless, Professor Velthari said quietly. We have forgotten how to work with basic principles. But when human technology fails, they repair it and continue their mission. This makes humans more reliable explorers than any advanced species, he concluded, not despite their limitations, but because of how they have learned to work within those limitations. The auditorium erupted in discussion again. This time, Professor Velthari allowed it to continue for several minutes before calling for order. There is more, he said. I contacted Human Space Command to verify my findings. The auditorium fell silent again. Direct contact with primitive species was almost never done by Academy faculty. I discovered that humans have been aware of our existence for over 50 years, Professor Velthari announced. They have been observing our activities and learning from our methods. Shocked gasps and sounds of surprise came from throughout the audience. But they chose not to contact us, he continued. When I asked why, the human response was illuminating. They said, and I quote, "We were not ready to teach, and you were not ready to learn." Teach? A luminal professor asked in musical tones of confusion. What could primitives teach us? Professor Velthari's form brightened. Exactly what my students demonstrated this week. How to solve problems when advanced methods fail. How to build systems that work reliably under any conditions. How to think beyond the limitations of specialized technology. He gestured toward Minho, Suin, and Wubin. These students have been trying to teach us for months. We dismissed their suggestions because we believed our methods were superior. But they were offering knowledge we had lost. Knowledge we had lost? Asked a psionic professor. Basic problem-solving skills, Professor Velthari replied. Understanding of fundamental principles. The ability to work with limited resources. Humans retained these capabilities because they never had the option to transcend them. The professor displayed one final hologram. It showed human colonies on hostile worlds, research stations in dangerous regions of space, and exploration ships, traveling to places that would destroy any advanced vessel. Humans are not primitive, Professor Velthari concluded. They are practical. And in many situations, practical solutions are superior to advanced ones. He looked around the auditorium at hundreds of advanced beings who were beginning to understand something new about the nature of intelligence and capability. I propose that we invite human instructors to the Academy, he said. Not as primitive species to be studied, but as masters of fundamental principles who can teach us what we have forgotten. The suggestion caused another wave of discussion, but this time the tone was different. Instead of dismissal or confusion, there was genuine interest and curiosity. Minho felt Suen grab his arm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "He wants to invite human teachers." "I heard," Minho replied, still trying to process what had just happened. "I think we just went from being examples of evolutionary failure to being examples of practical wisdom." Wubin was taking notes, as always. "The real question," he said quietly, "is whether the other species will be able to learn basic principles after relying on advanced technology for so long." "Some will," Minho said with confidence. The emergency alarms continued to wail as students and faculty hurried through the academy corridors. Minho, Suen, and Wubin followed the crowd toward the emergency assembly areas, but something felt different about this crisis. "Look at how they're reacting," Suen said quietly, watching alien students around them. "They're scared, but not panicked." She was right. The Luminols were flickering nervously but maintaining their energy patterns. The Saurians moved quickly but with purpose. Even the psionics seemed more focused than frightened. "Maybe Professor Velthari's lecture had more impact than we thought," Wubin suggested. They reached the main assembly hall where Professor Velthari was coordinating the response. His crystalline form was blazing with activity as he received reports from Academy staff. "Multiple system failures across the station," he was announcing. "Artificial gravity in sections 7 through 12. Life support irregularities in the outer rings. Communication arrays operating at minimal capacity." A quantum professor approached him urgently. "Sir, the reality stabilization fields are fluctuating. If they fail completely, the Academy's dimensional anchors could destabilize." "Understood," Professor Velthari replied. "Begin standard emergency protocols." But as Minho watched, he noticed something strange. The emergency protocols weren't working as expected. Teams of advanced beings were attempting to repair systems, using their usual methods, but many of their abilities seemed compromised. "The energy disturbance is affecting our technology," a Saurian engineer reported. "Crystalline matrix generators are not responding to mental commands. Telepathic networks are experiencing severe interference," added a psionic technician. "We cannot coordinate repairs through mental linkage." "Dimensional phase generators are offline," called out a dimensional worker. "We cannot access the parallel repair channels." Professor Velthari's form flickered with what looked like realization. The Academy was experiencing exactly the kind of cascade failure he had used as a theoretical scenario just weeks before. "Professor," Crix called out, his scales bright yellow with urgency. "The main reactor is showing instabilities. Our standard stabilization methods are not responding." "How long do we have?" Professor Velthari asked. "Unknown. Without our technology, we cannot predict the failure progression." "Can you repair it manually?" Crix looked confused. "Manually? I do not understand." "Using physical tools and basic engineering principles," the professor clarified. I do not know how to do that," Crix admitted, his scales turning gray with embarrassment. Around the assembly hall, similar conversations were taking place. Advanced beings capable of incredible feats were discovering that their specialized abilities were useless when the supporting technology failed. "This is exactly what happened in our scenario," Wubin observed quietly. Professor Velthari must have heard him, because the professor's crystalline head turned toward the three humans. For a moment, their eyes met across the chaotic assembly hall. Then Professor Velthari did something that shocked everyone present. He approached the human students directly. "Minho, Suen, Wubin," he said formally. "The Academy requires your assistance." "Our assistance?" Minho asked, surprised. "You have knowledge that we need," Professor Velthari explained. "Your people understand how to work with failed systems using basic principles. Can you help us stabilize the reactor?" The assembly hall had gone quiet. Hundreds of advanced beings were watching three primitive students being asked to solve a problem that their technology could not handle. "We can try," Suen said carefully, "but we'll need to understand the system first." "Show them," Professor Velthari commanded. Crix led them toward the reactor section, his scales shifting through confused colors. "I do not understand how this will help," he said as they walked. The reactor uses quantum crystalline matrices controlled by psychic resonance fields. It is far beyond primitive understanding. Maybe, Wubin replied. But at its core, it's still a power generation system. It follows basic thermodynamic principles. When they reached the reactor control room, Minho saw immediately what the problem was. Banks of crystalline controls were flickering erratically. Holographic displays showed system readings that were clearly unstable. Tell us what the reactor actually does, Suin requested. Not how you control it, but what physical process generates the power. It harnesses quantum fluctuations in crystalline matter, Crix explained. The mental control fields regulate the IO resonance frequencies. But what creates the actual energy? Wubin pressed. There has to be a fundamental physical process underneath all the advanced control systems. Crix looked uncertain. I think fusion reactions? The quantum fields contain and focus fusion processes? Fusion, Minho said with growing confidence. That's basic nuclear physics. We can work with that. But the control systems are not responding, Crix protested. Then we bypass the control systems, Suin replied simply. We use manual controls based on physical principles. The three humans began examining the reactor chamber, ignoring the advanced crystalline interfaces and looking for basic mechanical components. They found what they were looking for: physical coolant lines, mechanical containment systems, and simple pressure valves. It's actually a very elegant fusion reactor, Wubin said after studying the layout. But it's over-engineered. All these advanced controls are doing things that could be handled by simple mechanical systems. Can you stabilize it? Professor Velthari asked. He had followed them to the reactor room along with several other faculty members. Yes, Minho replied confidently. But we'll have to shut down the psychic control systems completely and run it on manual operation. Manual operation? Crix asked, alarmed. That sounds incredibly dangerous. It's actually safer, Suin explained. Manual systems can't malfunction due to energy interference. They respond directly to physical conditions. How do you know this will work? Professor Velthari asked. Because humans have been operating fusion reactors manually for over a century, Wubin replied. It's basic nuclear engineering. Working together, the three humans began the delicate process of shutting down the advanced control systems and engaging mechanical backups that most Academy staff didn't even know existed. They used simple tools and basic understanding of pressure, temperature, and nuclear physics. Coolant flow stabilizing, Suin reported, reading gauges that looked primitive compared to the holographic displays. Temperature dropping to safe levels. Containment. Field holding steady, Wubin added, monitoring mechanical pressure readings. No fluctuations detected. Fusion reaction stabilized, Minho concluded. The reactor will run safely on manual control until you can repair your advanced systems. The control room was silent except for the steady humming of the now stable reactor. Professor Velthari and the other faculty members stared at the humans with expressions of amazement. You stabilized our reactor in 20 minutes, Professor, Velthari said slowly, using methods that our engineers do not understand. We used methods that your engineers had forgotten, Minho corrected gently. The knowledge was always there, underneath the advanced technology. But how did you know what to do? Crix asked, his scales shifting through colors of confusion and wonder. Because it's the same physics humans use every day, Suin replied. Fusion is fusion, whether you control it with psychic fields or mechanical valves. Before anyone could respond, the Academy's communication system activated with an incoming signal. The main display screen showed a human in military uniform speaking from what was clearly a starship bridge. Galactic Academy. This is Admiral Hyunsik of the Terran Deep Space Fleet, the man said calmly. We detected your emergency situation and are responding to provide assistance. Professor Velthari approached the communication panel. Admiral, we appreciate your offer, but our situation is under control. Admiral Hyunsik smiled. Actually, Professor, we've been monitoring your academy for some time. We knew this test would eventually occur. Test? Professor Velthari asked, confused. The energy cascade failure affecting your station. Admiral, Hyunsik explained. It's a natural phenomenon that occurs near quantum crystalline structures. We've encountered it many times during our explorations. You know about this phenomenon? a quantum professor interrupted. "We've been dealing with it for decades," Admiral Hunsik replied. "It's one of the reasons human ships use basic technology. Advanced systems fail in these energy fields, but mechanical systems continue to operate normally." The Admiral gestured to something off-screen. "Computer, display current fleet positions." A three-dimensional star map appeared showing the local region of space. Scattered throughout were dozens of human vessels, many of them closer to the Academy than anyone had realized. "How long have you been watching us?" Professor Velthari asked quietly. "About 50 years," Admiral Hunsik admitted. "We've been curious about your teaching methods and the way you classify different species. And what conclusions have you reached?" Admiral Hyunsik's expression became serious. "That you have confused advancement with specialization. Your species have become incredibly capable within narrow areas, but helpless outside those specializations." "While humans remained generalists," Professor Velthari said, understanding dawning in his voice. "Exactly. We never transcended physical limitations because we couldn't, so we became extremely go,